Hello everyone, Loremaster of Sotek here. So for this Q&A video, I actually had to re-record it because I'm not sure what happened, but the old one got corrupted or something, but I couldn't get it to work. So without further ado, let's go ahead and hop into what questions we have left. This is the second to last video of the Dwarf Q&A, so be sure you don't miss the next one, which will come out tomorrow at 7 a.m., because that one will reveal what the next topic is going to be. So if you want to start, throwing all your questions in there, you can. So let's go ahead and hop into it. Our first question comes from Rob Schneider, who asks, what do dwarves eat and how do they view imperial dwarves? So we already answered the what do dwarves eat, I believe, in the second video. As for imperial dwarves, so they're called Ungdawi, so like Ungi, but Ungdawi. Generally, they're kind of looked down upon in a very, very light and vague sense. It honestly depends on how much of their culture they've managed to retain, and like how wealthy and how wealthy they are and how they've managed to do for themselves. But overall, like, willingly living away from your hold is considered pretty bizarre in dwarf culture. Like, dwarves don't like being out under the open sky. They prefer being underneath the earth. So, in that sense, they're kind of looked as being a little weird or a little crazy. But most dwarves will heavily not be a fan of one of their fellows if that dwarf has, like, forgotten parts of his culture, or his like coslet isn't very good. If you want to see a really, really good representation of this, you can read the novel Headtaker, which, although it is about Queek, it has a imperial dwarf in it who's a main character essentially, and you can learn a lot about their culture and how the hold of Karakazul handles him. Our next question comes from Guardian of Metal, who asks, do you think there is always as much Bugman's septuple X as the plot demands, or Bugman's XXXXXX, which is considered like the most amazing magical god tier beer in the Warhammer universe? And yes, I do think there's as much as the plot demands, because considering how much it tends to show up or is used as a plot device, I don't think Bugman made that much. So it definitely seems to be a magical material that there's always as much as there needs to be. Then we have a question from Dossict, who says, a question in regards to their ancient empire prior to the War of Vengeance's casualties. Could the dwarves of old have held out against the Greenskin invasions and Skaven assaults? And are there any notable hammers in dwarf stories of Warhammer? Okay, so for the first question, with the ancient dwarves with the ancestor gods, yeah, they could have easily gone toe-to-toe with, like, all of the Greenskins and Skaven, especially if their empire was restored to the pre-War of Vengeance status. So essentially, if you had the numbers that they had, you had the technology and abilities that they had, and then their empire wasn't cracked open. So if the earthquakes had never happened, I honestly don't think there's anything the Skaven or the Greenskins could have done to really pose a dramatic threat to the Dwarven Empire. Because you have to remember, before the earthquakes came, and before the War of Vengeance, not only were there way more dwarves, because the war against the elves was devastating to both sides, but on top of that, the dwarves, the underways, are these big, colossal, like underground hallways that connect all the different holds. And before the earthquakes happened, which started off the Age of Woe, they were basically like perfectly designed so that there were no cracks. They didn't leave any weird caves. They were 100% defensible. All of the walls had been like designed by the ancient dwarves. I mean, even without the ancestor gods, just returning the dwarves to pre-earthquake status, I think they could have easily held off the Skaven and the Greenskins, even at their primes. Like, maybe they would have been able to take down a couple of the minor holds, But like the major holds, like Karak Eight Peaks, Karazakara, Karakadrin, Karakazul, Zufbar, like all those guys, they could have easily held out for almost ever against those guys, just because you're dealing with. They could have effortlessly reinforced each other using the underway, and you can't breach the underway normally. Like, sure, the Skaven could have like tried to dig tunnels into the underway, and same thing with the greenskins, but it would have been really difficult, and the dwarves would have known about it really, really fast. Like, there was no stealthy way to infiltrate the underway before the earthquakes, and the dwarves would have been so much better prepared to deal with all those situations. And even the War of Vengeance and the Earthquake was just kind of a nasty 1-2 punch that really messed up the Dwarven Empire. So yeah, I would say that they could have held out against the Greenskin Skaven if you popped them back. As for famous name/notable hammers, the best ones, there's the Hammer of Kalak-Thraz, which of course is a legendary runic hammer from what is now known as Black Crag that was rediscovered. You can read about it a little. It's available in Total War Warhammer as an item you can get. You can even take it in custom battles or multiplayer. It's an item that the Rune Smiths have. There's also Clad Brakak, which I talked about pretty extensively in my Future of the Dwarves video, because that's the runic hammer of Thoric Ironbrow, the Rune Lord special character. That hammer is very, very legendary, because it not only can it be used to hit runes and cast like rune magic from the Anvils of Doom, but it also has such amazing runes on it designed to shatter enemy weapons that it can rather easily, if it comes into contact with really powerful enemy magic weapons, it'll just shatter them into little bits. Though probably my obviously there's Galmaraz, the Warhammer, which is a dwarf Warhammer that was given to Sigmar a long time ago. But probably my favorite hammer from the lore is the Hammer of Fate, which is in the Gotrek and Felix novel Demon Slayer. It is a crazy hammer that has like ridiculous powers. So if you want to check that out, I'd really recommend going and reading that book. Dat Orc Boss asks, have the dwarves ever really interacted with the lizardmen before, violently or otherwise? Did their societal focus on order align enough ever to broker an alliance between the two factions? What are they thinking of each other on a racial level? So we've answered this one a couple times, but just to kind of quickly summarize it, is that the lizardmen were the ones, I believe, who wiped out the very first dwarf hold ever built, Karak Zorn. But it's likely that the lizardmen wiped it out because the dwarves there were corrupted due to the manipulations of a greater demon of Tzeentch, who I'm not exactly sure if he took advantage of the dwarves' greed and got them to the point where they stole something important from the lizardmen and the lizardmen came to take it back and wipe them out, or if he corrupted them to the point that the lizardmen saw them as like a threat to the Great Plan and wiped them out. But although the dwarves and the lizardmen would make really, really good natural allies due to a lot of their order tendencies and alignment, the major issue between the two of them always comes down to gold, quite frankly. It would almost always lead to conflict, because dwarves have serious problems keeping themselves in check when it comes to dealing with gold. So the issue there is that sooner or later some dwarf would get really greedy and steal something they're not supposed to steal, and then when the lizardmen would demand it back, the dwarves' stubbornness and pride would cause them to dig in their heels, and then they'd start fighting and it would be a mess. As far as like what do they think each other on the racial level, the dwarves for the most part probably do consider the lizardmen to be myths. And if they do believe the lizardmen exist, then they just really consider them like an ancient and irrelevant race that's like far past their prime and not really their concern. As far as the lizardmen are concerned, they value the dwarves very, very much as part of the Great Plan. But the thing about the Great Plan is that they only value the dwarves when the dwarves are where they are supposed to be. So the dwarves are supposed to be in the World's Edge Mountains in the old world. And if they're like, or at least in those mountain ranges, if they're outside of the old world, the lizardmen are really not okay with that, because that doesn't fit with their understanding of the Great Plan. But hopefully that answers that. Laloren asks, in dwarf culture, is there some rules or traditions for who gets to marry a female dwarf because there's so few dwarf women than men? For example, can a poor miner marry a female dwarf the same way a thane or a much richer lord could? Maybe they consider a poor miner of lesser ancestor worse than someone of royal blood. I guess my question really is, can dwarves choose who they marry? Okay, so most of the time, I'd say 90% of the time, the clan of a dwarf is the one who arranges the marriage. So it is very, very rare for dwarves to marry for love. When two clans have a marriage, it is almost always for political, logistical, or financial gain. There have been a few love stories among the Dawi where like love has triumphed, but it's very, very rare. Generally, no, dwarves don't marry for love. They have a very practical approach to it. But sometimes they do, but most of the time, no. There is like a really famous story of this Rune Smith or Rune Lord who basically there was a dwarf king who offered the pick of his treasure trove if anyone could help him defeat like this really powerful giant. So this Rune Smith created a suit of armor that was capable of basically making the bearer immune to damage from the giant's attacks. Like it just easily thwarted the damage. And so he, killed the giant, and the king honored his oath and was like, all right, you can pick any one of my treasures. And he chose the king's beautiful daughter, which was kind of a loose interpretation of what the king said, and it led to like a whole bunch of shenanigans. And it's like a really famous dwarven legend. And it's like so famous it's split up into two parts. There's the first part is about him like going through the effort to create the armor and killing the giant. And then the second part is about all the shenanigans unleashed by him picking the king's daughter as his prize. But that's like the closest thing dwarves have to a love story. But, there are dwarves who have been fortunate enough to get married and then they fall in love. Like Ungrim and his wife are very in love. And Belagar and Kemma are very in love. Leap of Faith 97 asks, how are dwarf-human relations prior to Sigmar creating the alliance structure we see today? They were okay. They were decent. Trade was already pretty much flourishing between the two races, and they would be occasional allies. The main difference between then and now is that the dwarves didn't consider men to be like true friends and allies. So if like a really dire or grave threat arrived, the dwarves' response would usually be to go into their holds and seal the doors and wait it out. But after their pact with Sigmar, their response basically changed to become, no, we're going to march out even in these horrifying situations and go fight side by side with our ally, or allies. So that was kind of like the main difference. But like the dwarves back then, they viewed humanity with a lot of potential, and they thought of it as their responsibility to basically help guide humanity. And they had a massive influence on the men of the Empire as far as like their language, culture, and fighting styles and their technology and stuff like that. Cold Rage 20 asks, can you explain Malekith's and Snorri's relationship in the elf colonies before Malekith went to the Chaos Waste and caused the war? Yeah, so long story short, Snorri Whitebeard and Malekith were just like BFFs. Like they were just best friends for life. Overall, and it's very important because Malekith was like the guy who discovered the dwarves. He was in one of the expeditions that found them for the first time. And he was the one who paved the way to establish friendly relations between the two races. And Malekith and Snorri Whitebeard, before Malekith got all evil and went crazy and stuff, were very, very similar in a lot of ways. And because of that, they were literally best friends. And they fought all sorts of horrible, horrible abominations and armies. Like, they were literally side-by-side allies against all sorts of demons and beastmen and just crazy amounts of nastiness. And as far as like the relationship between the colonies and the dwarves, they were a little tense because of like significant cultural differences between the two races. But overall, they were pretty friendly just because the trade between the two of them was just insanely lucrative. Next, we've got the Giga Slayer, who asks, how do Dwarven runes work? Are they magic? Can a demonic entity possess or be entombed within one? We already answered that. As far as the demonic entity part, technically, a demon could be entombed within a rune, but it would be super difficult. I mean, that's for the regular dwarves. Chaos dwarves, that's what they like specialize in. Demon Smiths for the Chaos Dwarves are basically Rune Smiths who specialize in binding demons into like physical materials. So like they like hell cannons are literally demons that have been bound into constructs made out of metal and flesh. So demonic entities can't really possess runes, no, but they can be like entombed within them. Absolutely, that's what demon smithing is of the Chaos Dwarfs. Three-Headed Book of Grudges asks, what happened to Grimnir after he went to the Stellar Gate? Was his body preserved or corrupted, or was his soul consumed by the gods of chaos? So, no. So when Grimnir went north, he held off the forces of chaos, which bought the elves on Ulthuan a little. It helped significantly the elves on Ulthuan with unleashing the vortex. But the really, really big thing is that somehow there was basically a third gate to the realm of chaos. So there's the one at the North Pole, the one at the Southern Pole, and then there was another one that was basically somewhere in the old world. And they go over this in the Gotrek and Felix book, Slayer, which is the very last one. And, well, it's the last one for Warhammer Fantasy. But basically, Grimnir spent all of time since Chaos was defeated with the creation of the Vortex. He basically held that gate by himself, fighting against the forces of Chaos nonstop. Just being like a crazy super badass, fighting an endless war against endless legions. Very, very successfully until the end times happened, where he handed over his job to Gotrek, and then he went and fought side by side with the dwarves for the end times, and then things popped over to Grimnir died in Age of Sigmar, is when he finally ended up dying against the salamander named Volcatrix, but you know, it's AOS stuff. So Rotting Potato 94 asks, so we know about the first Chaos invasion, all with the elves and the lizards fighting them. What were the dwarves doing then? So, long story short, basically, when Chaos invaded the world, the lizardmen dealt with the brunt of it for a really long time, but slowly got ground back. And over time, each one of the Chaos gods kind of took on a particular role. So, like, Tzeentch sent Kairos Fateweaver to deal with invading Lustria and overwhelming the lizardmen. Slaanesh sent Nakari, the greatest of the Keeper of Secrets, to invade Ulthuan and wipe out the elves. And Nurgle sent Kugoth Plaguefather to wipe out the dwarves. And then Khorne was just being Khorne and, you know, curb stomping everyone in existence. And enjoying the insanity of it all. So Kugoth Plaguefather led the invasion of the Dwarven realms. And he was super successful for a good while. Because though Kugoth, Nurgle hates the dwarves more than any of the other gods because they're very naturally resistant to his diseases, because A, they're already very tenacious and tough, so they already very rarely get sick. But on top of that, Nurgle's diseases are magical in essence. So essentially, dwarves have like double resistance to it because obviously they're, very magically resistant. So ultimately, though, Kugoth went and battled the dwarves who were fighting with, alongside the ancestor gods and all this stuff. And in the culmination of the war, Kugoth was winning, like wiping out occasional dwarf outposts and settlements and stuff. It kept pushing them back and back and back until he pushed them all the way back to Karaz. And there, what the dwarves did is basically, when Kugoth arrived, he found the walls like abandoned and like the gates, like he was able to just waltz right in. And so Kugoth believed that he had finally managed to break the dwarves' spirit and infect them with despair. So he fully unleashed his army and went charging in looking for the dwarves to slaughter them. And basically what the dwarves did is they waited until Kugoth and his army came all the way into through like the underground passages into the hold. And they were at like the very last wall. And as soon as his army entered under the mountain, they basically gave a signal and set off a series of crazy charges that caused the part of the mountain that Kugoth and his army were under to just fall on top of them and just instantly crushed the entire army, including Kugoth, just popped them. And so the entire demonic legion was completely wiped out. And at that point, basically what the dwarves did is they kind of huddled in Karaz and tried to, and they basically waited out the war at that point. There were either, I'm not sure if it was before or after that, but there was a point where Grimnir basically kept leading armies of dwarves out into the wider world to fight against the forces of chaos, because during one of those incursions is when Grimnir met Kalidor Dragon Tamer, and the elves and the dwarves had their very, very first meeting. But overall, because the one thing that a lot of people don't necessarily understand about the Great Catastrophe is that, or the Great Cataclysm, whichever you want to call it, is that it wasn't like the demons came out and there was a huge war that lasted for like 10 years and it was over. It lasted for a really long time, like thousands of years. Centuries at least. But it was a super long war, because although the demons could be defeated, they couldn't be permanently defeated. So basically an army of demons would show up, somebody would beat them, and they'd all poof back to the Forge of Souls in the Realm of Chaos, get reforged, and then keep invading. So they came in waves, essentially. Which is how we had stuff like Anarion was the Phoenix King of the Hyles for like a good long while, because he fought the demons on multiple occasions, because he would beat them and Ulthuan would be safe for like a decade, and then the demons would invade again, and they'd have another fight, and then he'd win and the demons would invade again. And it was the same thing with the dwarves, the lizardmen, and the elves. But ultimately, like the dwarves, the big way they solved their situation is that they dropped a mountain on Kugoth and his army, and just kind of hunkered down and waited for it to be over. So Slayer King's question is, can the dwarves in 8th edition still create adamant and lithero, the stuff the sword Lithendrong was made out of? Probably, but there's no mention of those materials in 8th edition. So I would say that they are not non-existent or able to forge them because they are not mentioned. So like the absence of lore does not necessarily mean that it's not active. It's just the storylines those came from just kind of aren't pertinent or used in the modern lore. But I would not be surprised if that was kind of like a minor note. So they probably can, but they haven't been mentioned anywhere in 8th edition. Cat59 asks, what happened to the Dwarven Golems, and could more still be made / the knowledge to make them be required? So I believe we've already answered this, but just a quick refresh. There's not enough magic left in the world to make the Dwarven Golems function anymore, and much of the runic lore needed to get them up and moving and activate them has been lost over the millennia. if the knowledge to remake them could be reacquired, which is like one of the main desires of Thoric Ironbrow, is he's basically been running around trying to rediscover all the old ancient lost lore and put like everything together. Theoretically, they can maybe find a way to get them to work again by learning to adjust the runes to create them to work in the magically depleted environment since the vortex was created, but it would be insanely difficult. Best case scenario for the dwarves to reactivate the runic golems would be that the vortex would have to be unbound, and then they would also have to rediscover the runes needed to activate the golems. Uncle Ruckus says, or asked, does a Rune Smith have the chance to take on a position like a Dwarven Thane, Lord, King, etc., or does he give up any opportunity to further his self and his own clan so he can carry on with practicing his craft? So, yeah, no. Once you join Clan Morgrim, which is the Runesmith clan, you're essentially stuck. Taking over a position of power within any of the guilds essentially prevents you from becoming like a Thane or a King. So, like, if you join the Engineering Guild, or you become a prominent member of the Mining Guild, or the any of the crafting guilds, or the trade guilds, or any of the super clans, like you join like one of the religions, like you become a priest of Grugni, or Valea, or Grimnir, or you join Clan Morgrim, which are the Runesmiths, then you essentially give up your ability to become a Thane or King in most cases. Obviously, there are occasional exceptions, like Ungrim, being that they have like the Slayer Oath on top of the King Oath, but they were kings before they became Slayers. So, and that's like a contradiction in Dwarven politics / beliefs. Zarkax asks, why is Barkvar the only real coastal settlement for the dwarves? Ultimately, the dwarves are a race that are very bound to like the earth, and they really don't like the ocean. Just like they don't like the concept of flying very much, the dwarves, the ocean, kind of like I've talked about with mounts, the ocean is very like unpredictable, dangerous, and you can't control it. And the dwarves find that very uncomfortable on many levels. What makes Barkvar, though, unique, and why the dwarves even set up there in the first place, is because ultimately dwarves only, except for the Skaranari, which were the hill dwarves who got wiped out during the War of Vengeance, but they were dwarves that like inhabited kind of more open spaces, which ended up being a really bad thing for them. But ultimately, the Barkvar is like this giant cavern mountain structure. It's like a huge hollow cave, but it's massive, that is like right on this massive river, and it forms like this natural not amphitheater, but it's this just huge natural cave that has like a massive water feature in it. The dwarves of Barkvar initially moved in because of the actual mountain structure, and then over time they kind of developed an affinity for the ocean and developed trade and a bunch of other stuff. So it wasn't necessarily that the dwarves who were the ancestors of Barkvar and founded the settlement, it wasn't that they went there for the purpose of founding a port, it just kind of worked out that way. And it took a really long time for the dwarves of Barkvar to become comfortable with the ocean. But of course they figured it out eventually, and like their engineers of course then invented some really powerful ships like the Ironclads, which are of course massive steel structures that are steam powered and have really crazy weaponry and can stand against like horrifying sea monsters and natural disasters and stuff like that. Keblam asks, who is the dwarfiest dwarf to have ever dwarfed? Crag the Grim. Thanks, great question. 10 out of 10. White Knight 16 asks, how come the dwarves can't or won't cast magic? They can cast magic. We see it a lot with the Chaos Dwarves. The reason they don't, though, is because magic is very unreliable and unpredictable, and it has a very high tendency to backfire. But whereas most people might get like a nosebleed or something not necessarily super major, though it can be very major when they miscast, dwarves when dwarves miscast, it is guaranteed a part of their body will turn to stone. And if it's like an organ or like their head or something, then they die instantly. So, not worth the risk. Uncle Ruckus says, has there ever been a case where dwarves and human descendants have been friends with each other for generations? Yes! That actually happens fairly frequently. Not like super common because the dwarves aren't the friendliest people, but a really good case of that was the king of Zufbar was friends with a man he met when the man was a boy, because it's a long story, but this boy did something to help the dwarves of Zufbar significantly, and the king of Zufbar kept Baradan kept very friendly relations. King Baradan kept friendly relations with that man's family. And he kind of notes that he misses the original one because that was his, like, they were kind of actual friends. But to dwarves, humans live for such a short period of time, and it's like they blink and all of a sudden, like, the person they knew is dead and, like, it's their grandson. But if you get the Masters of Stone and Steel omnibus book and you read the, I forget exactly what the book's called, but if you read basically they have the life story of King Baradan as one of the stories, and if you read that tale, he talks about that. Dan Orkboss says, do half dwarves exist? Has there ever been a recorded case of a dwarf and a human having a romantic relationship? Can female dwarves take on the Slayer Oath, join Crafters Guild, or be in the dwarf army? So, do half anything exist? No. This is not Warcraft, Lord of the Rings, or D&D. There are no halvesies in Warhammer Fantasy. All of the major races are fundamentally different. So it'd be like us trying to, be halvesies with a chimpanzee and an orangutan or something. It's not going to work. That being said, there have been romantic relationships between different species. So, like, it is not unheard of in the Warhammer Fantasy universe for, like, a halfling. Halflings are notorious for trying and succeeding sometimes to sleep with, like, humans or dwarves. But there have been, like, dwarves who have had romantic or at least sexual relationships with humans, for instance. And elves, of course, are notorious for being very open-minded when it comes to new experiences. I'm pretty sure dark elves, there's at least a dark elf who has slept with every species under the sun. So, but there are no half children. Can female dwarves taking on the Slayer? So I answered this about female Slayers, but female Slayers can join, or female dwarves can join the army, let's start with the Slayer one. They can become Slayers, very, very rare, and it's soul crushing for the dwarves when that happens. That is like terrible, terrible situation. That is like tragedy level situation. Crafters Guild, that happens a ton. Like Priestesses of Valea are almost always female dwarves, and that is one of the, and like female dwarves, like a lot of them have like regular jobs, like they become miners or smiths or crafters or rune smiths, or like they do stuff. They're not like they're not pigeonholed into just being like women. They have jobs and they do stuff. So yeah, you'll find them all over the Crafters Guilds. And being in the army, super duper rare unless they are like a Priestess of Valea. Priestesses of Valea can like use rune magic. Like they have, they're not rune smiths in the sense that they don't like tend to craft runes, but they are able to unleash rune magic, and they have the ability to use like healing magic, or they have the ability to like unleash. They're very, very good anti-magic or anti-wizard duelists. So it's not unusual at all to see Priestesses of Valea on the battlefield. Berther asks, could the Warhammer dwarves get along with dwarves from other universes such as Warcraft, Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, The Witcher, The Dwarves, the book series, or Dragon Age, or would they end up going to war over their differences, and how would they relate to other races? Ultimately, I really doubt it. the Warhammer dwarves are ridiculously stubborn and take oaths to such a serious level that it's very alien to us as humans. You know, the concept to us of you make a promise, and if you break that promise, you literally have to commit ritual suicide by combat. That's pretty extreme, even for dwarves of other universes. I think sooner or later, war would always break out between Warhammer Fantasy dwarves and the dwarves of other universes, especially because a lot of those other universes have dwarves that like ride on mounts or use magic, like they have wizards, and that really would not go over well. Like dwarves would hate that. The only dwarves I think would have a chance of getting along with Warhammer Fantasy dwarves that I know of, there are a couple of there that I'm not super familiar with. Like I'm not familiar with the Dwarves, the book series. But the only one of those off the top of my head that I think they would get along with very well would probably be the dwarves of the Lord of the Rings universe. But even then, Warhammer dwarves are kind of like a parody of the Lord of the Ring dwarves. Because they're literally based off of the Lord of the Ring dwarves. They basically take all of their flaws and dial it up to 11. So I think sooner or later there would be problems. But yeah. So that answers all the questions for this video. Thank you all for joining me. We have one more tomorrow, and then that's it. We're done with the Dwarf Q&A, and we got other stuff on the horizon. So thank you all for your questions. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.